Ladies and gentlemen, please grab a seat. Thank you for joining us. I hope you had the chance to grab a bite. Still coffee and water there. Welcome to the Washington Institute. My name is Bilal Wahab. I'm the Wagner Fellow here at the Institute. First things first, this meeting is on the record. We're actually broadcasting it live via our webcast, so please feel free to tweet about it on your silenced phones. Thank you. In coordination with the government of Iraq, the European Union, the United Nations, the World Bank, over the three-day event earlier this week in Kuwait, Kuwait City hosted the International Conference for Reconstruction of Iraq, which aimed to address over $80 billion of funds that Iraq needs to rebuild areas destroyed by Daesh or ISIS and the consequent war and battles to regain and liberate those territories from the terrorist caliphate. Moreover, reconstruction is necessary to resettle thousands, tens of thousands of displaced Iraqis, which is an important feat for Iraq's elections scheduled for May 2018, later this year, to take place. More than 25 countries and organizations pledged nearly $30 billion in loans, credit lines, grants, and investment projects to support the reconstruction strategy that the Iraqi government presented at the Kuwait conference. So here are some questions about what happened earlier this week. Will Gulf governments and their backing and the World Bank guarantees be enough to implement such a strategy that Iraq put forward? How will the United States support this plan, given the administration's allergy to quote the president, the costly business of nation building, end of quote. Iraq's financial needs are sizable, but so is the country's wealth. Iraq currently exports record quantities of oil. About 60% of Iraqis are young, under the age of 25 years, and therefore capable to work and rebuild a country of their own. But how should Iraq adapt to this shift in Washington and the broader international development community away from providing direct development funding to encouraging private sector and foreign direct investment? Can the government reform its economy and curb corruption, which is the main malice of Iraq? To address these questions, we have an excellent lineup of speakers and expertise here in the room. In the reverse order of speakers, we have Jeffrey Batt, the gentleman in the center. Jeff has been investing in on the Iraq Stock Exchange since January 2008. In 2010, Mr. Batt launched the Euphrates Iraq Fund, which holds investment in banking, real estate, and consumer products. He was a senior advisor to the Atlantic Council's task force on the future of Iraq. Mr. Batt studied philosophy at Columbia University. And then to my far left, Shelley Culbertson is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Her research focuses on her research focus includes refugees, education, international development in the Middle East. She has concluded a study. Let me show off here. This recent report about stabilization and humanitarian needs in Iraq and the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Before joining RAND, she worked at the State Department and studied at Princeton University. She is also the author of a book called The Fires of Spring, a post-Arab Spring journey through the turbulent Middle East. Last but not least, and the first of our speakers is to my immediate left, Alexander Zettel is currently serving as the economic chief in the Office of Iraq Affairs at the State Department. Previously, she served 2 years in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad as the chief of the External Political Affairs. Her previous assignments also included Turkmenistan, Russia, and Washington, D.C. Prior to her government service, Alexandra worked as a tax consultant for Ernst & Young. So I'll go and join my colleagues and pose questions to each of them. Each one will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, addressing my initial questions, and then we'll open up to your questions, to whom I look forward to. So, Alex, first of all, tell us about the Kuwait conference. You just came back, and well, thank you specifically, especially for joining us. You must be jet lagged. I was just telling her that I'm surprised that her eyes are open. She just returned from Kuwait late last night, so special thanks for joining us this morning. So what was this conference? I think the very idea of the conference is a little bit confusing. The way it was covered in the media, the way that it was presented by different actors. It was an elephant that everyone touched a different part of it. If you could clear the fog, was it a donors conference, an investors conference? And then how do you assess its outcome and the U.S. role and the role of Iraq's neighbors in rebuilding Iraq?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Bilal, for the generous introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Washington Institute for organizing this event today, and I'm very pleased that I have this opportunity to talk to you about Iraq's reconstruction efforts. As Bilal mentioned, I just returned from Kuwait. I was there for the 3-day reconstruction conference that the government of Kuwait, the government of Iraq, with close coordination with the EU, the UN, and the World Bank were hosting. It was a 3-day event that brought together high-level government officials, civil society, private sector, and the investment institutions to help Iraq mobilize support for Iraq Reconstruction Conference. On the first day of the conference, the government of Iraq launched the 10-year reconstruction and development framework. They've been working on it jointly with the World Bank, and it was the result of their damage assessment, damage and needs assessment, and a national investment and national development plan. And it sets the framework for government reforms, private sector investment, and international financing to help rebuild communities, create jobs in Iraq, and modernize Iraq's economy. And as Bilal mentioned, after a 3-day event, more than 25 countries and multilateral organizations pledged nearly $30 billion in loans, grants, and investment projects to support Iraq's reconstruction. The conference just ended, but we can already say that it was a tremendous success. The extraordinary financial assistance from regional governments provides unequivocal support for the defeat ISIS and demonstrates strong desire to see Iraq prosper and better integrate into the region. We were particularly encouraged by the unprecedented support offered by Iraq's neighbors and their contributions. As you might be already tracking, Kuwait offered $2 billion in assistance, Turkey over $5 billion, Saudi Arabia $1.5 billion, Qatar $1 billion, United Arab Emirates over $5.5 billion, and Arab Social Fund $1.5 billion. And these numbers represent a mix of sovereign loans, non-sovereign credit, financing and project guarantees, as well as private sector investment. The events in Kuwait earlier this week are only the first step in a much larger endeavor to rebuild Iraq. And for 3 years, ISIS displaced millions of civilians, plundered cities, and devastated public infrastructure. The magnitude of destruction requires a long-term commitment towards rebuilding the country, and the United States will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Iraq to help them with that effort. And I have to mention that even before this conference, and since 2014, the United States was already the largest donor, providing more than $6 billion in economic and security assistance to Iraq. This includes $1.7 billion in humanitarian assistance, and then $265 million for stabilization efforts. The latter allowed, internally displaced people over 3 billion return to their homes. The United States remains committed to a stable, prosperous, and unified Iraq, and has contributed greatly towards the support for Iraq's macroeconomic stability. In January 2017, Iraq closed on a $1 billion sovereign bond issuance that was guaranteed by the United States, and as a condition of this loan, Iraq later completed a separate $1 billion unenhanced bond sale in August 2017. Both loans provide Iraq with access to low-cost financing to service critical public services while creating the fiscal conditions for responsible economic growth. These efforts, together with Iraq's essential work with the World Bank and the IMF, have helped maintain its macroeconomic stability even throughout the terrible war that it fought against ISIS. The United States never envisioned the Iraq Reconstruction Conference to be a pledging event. It was not about meeting a specific goal or crossing a threshold of donations. To put it another way, Kuwait conference was not crowdfunding. And that is because Iraq cannot meet its long-term reconstruction needs exclusively through humanitarian assistance, cash grants, or international monetary assistance program. Iraq must reform and grow its economy through private sector investment, which will lay the foundation for long-term and multi-year path toward job creation and sustainable recovery. Iraq's presentation at the conference showed the path Iraq would take over the next 10 years. Following the war with ISIS and leading up to the Reconstruction Conference, the body government signaled a willingness to implement a set of economic reforms, fight corruption, and ease barriers to foreign and domestic investment. Promoting U.S. business in Iraq is a top priority for State Department and our embassy in Baghdad, and we're working hand in hand with our colleagues from interagency on that effort. Therefore, mobilizing the innovative capabilities of American companies is and will continue to be a critical component of the United States strategy to expand economic ties and increase foreign investment to enable Iraq's reconstruction. The State Department partnered with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to organize a large delegation of American companies to participate in the Reconstruction Conference. And I don't know, many of you might recall, initially the government of Iraq planned or anticipated 400 to 500 participants in the private sector event that was happening on February 13. The response from private sector was overwhelming. And we've learned, when I talked to Dr. Sami, who is the head of the National Investment Committee, on the day of the event, he said that there were 2,800 participants who registered for it. So because of this overwhelming interest, they had to switch the venue. So it just tells you how much interest there is from the private sector in Iraq. And during the February 13 private sector portion of the Kuwait conference, representatives from American companies and other foreign investors reviewed and evaluated close to 200 projects prioritized by the Iraqi government for private sector investment. And these are the projects that will rehabilitate critical infrastructure, restore transportation networks, energize the health and educational sectors, and create efficiencies in Iraq's oil and gas industries. With their strategic vision, financial backing, and technical capacity, the United States brought to Kuwait some of the most advanced companies capable of designing sustainable long-term economic solutions that will create a modern 21st century economy in Iraq. And it was very clear during the messaging from the government of Iraq during the conference, Iraq is now open for business, and the American private sector is already thriving there. And in just last few months, we've seen American companies completing commercial agreements to supply Iraq with over $2 billion of agricultural products, power generation, and electrical grid rehabilitation equipment, and renewable energy technologies. The United States remains committed to Iraq's strategy to diversify its economy and build a robust private sector that will increase jobs and generate central government revenues to rebuild critical infrastructure and modernize key sectors of the Iraqi economy. As Secretary Tillerson announced at the Reconstruction Conference, the United States will support American companies with their new investment in Iraq through the Export-Import Bank and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And on Tuesday, at the private sector portion of the event, the Exim Bank and the Iraq's Ministry of Finance signed a memorandum of understanding that will make available $3 billion of export credit financing for U.S. companies that want to invest in key sectors of Iraq's economy, including energy, transportation, and commodities. Similarly, OPEC, which supports economic development through a model of investment, is currently managing 5 projects in Iraq worth $250 million, and is reviewing over $500 million of new projects proposals. OPEC financing over the years has helped Iraq increase the supply of affordable housing and provided support for entrepreneurs to start or expand their existing businesses in Iraq. So in closing, the United States remains committed to Iraq's stability and the recovery efforts. The Strategic Framework Agreement, which was signed in 2008, will continue to serve as the basis upon which the United States deepens trade and commercial ties with Iraq, while advocating for economic reforms that reduce corruption, streamline visa and business procedures, and enforce contracts and arbitrary disputes. The government of Iraq's 10-year Reconstruction and Development Framework is impressive and ambitious, but it is right, and the United States will support Prime Minister Abadi in his effort to attract investment and grow his country's economy, not only today, but over decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, very much. I'm sure there will be a lot of follow-up questions on some of the data, but also assertions that you made there. But let's hold on until we hear from the colleagues, and then we get to those questions. But thank you very much. That was quite comprehensive and touched many of the key bases. Shelley, on to you. You also recently came back from Iraq, and you do visit Iraq quite often. You and your colleague also wrote this excellent report that I showed earlier to the audience. What did you conclude are the main humanitarian needs, but also the security challenges for resettlement to take place, which is a prelude and a very important condition for elections to take place in May, but also for the broader governance, not only of the liberated territories, but for democratic governance, inclusive governance in Iraq. Where do you see this conference fitting in, and what are those challenges that Iraq itself needs to address?
Thank you very much, Bilal, for the kind introduction, and thank you all of you for coming. Good afternoon. I'll give an overview of the report that a colleague and I did about stabilization challenges and humanitarian challenges in Iraq with a focus on Mosul. And as Bilal had just mentioned, I was in Baghdad and Erbil a couple of weeks ago doing some briefings of it, and then also getting some updates. So I'll provide a broad overview of our findings as well as what some of the gaps are, I think, still after the Kuwait conference. So our study looked at what are the steps that need to happen after the military operations to bring immediate stability to Mosul and then other parts of Iraq, and then also to help displaced people get home, and then once they get home to find conditions that allow them to remain home. So to do this, we looked at 4 areas, the 4 that Bilal mentioned: the humanitarian situation, security, resumption of city life, and then governance and reconciliation. So we looked at whatever available data there was, did about 50 interviews with many of the leaders of the response, and then did a number of visits to Iraq to do this. And I think the bottom line conclusion is that without continued and sustained investment in helping Iraqis achieve a normal life once again, Iraq could unravel very quickly. And so there's a lot of support that is needed to help Iraq. Iraq provided a global public good in its role in defeating ISIS, and took heavy casualties and destruction of its cities. And so there's a lot that can be done to help Iraq recover as well. So in terms of the humanitarian situation, overall 5.7 million Iraqis were displaced between ISIS and the fighting to liberate parts of Iraq from ISIS. That is such a huge number. I'm astonished every time I hear it. But I think a big success is that over 3 million people have been able to return home. But that still leaves 2.6 million displaced Iraqis, 1.6 million of whom are from Nineveh province, of which Mosul is the capital. And 400,000 of those people are still living in camps, which were built, they were meant to be temporary, but they're not up to international camp standards because they were built so quickly. So there are a number of issues that remain to be addressed and gaps with the humanitarian situation of these displaced people. So the first is that those who remain displaced maybe are some of the hardest people to actually get home. This is because their homes are destroyed, their local disputes with neighbors, lack of jobs, and this is particularly the case for families who may have supported ISIS but may or may not have had criminal activity as well. The next issue with this is the potential that some of the camps could turn into long-term urban slums. So I've looked at refugee issues for the past couple of years around the world, and in particular in the Middle East. And while camps are meant to be temporary and everyone goes in with that assumption, the tendency is that they can last for years, if not decades. So if you look at, say, the Zaatari camp in Jordan that was set up for the Syrians, that is now, with buildings and plumbing and electricity, turning into an urban center. So there's a risk that, in particular, some of the people from West Mosul may end up living in these camps unless there are ways to get them home. The next issue with this is the longer-term internally displaced persons. So over 70% of the kids who've been displaced have missed at least a year of school. So you've got a generation of displaced kids who've missed school and may have a hard time fitting back into the school system and then getting the education that they need for citizenship and a contribution to the economy. And then finally, among the displaced, the elections are in May. It's really important to find ways to get these 2.6 million people to vote. The majority of them are Sunni, and if this group as a bloc cannot vote, it will seriously call into question the legitimacy of the elections. And so there's some efforts underway to make this happen, but I think this is a big area where assistance could be additional to help that. The next issue we looked at was security, and in surveys of displaced people, security is the number one reason why they don't go home. There are two main issues with security. The first are mine hazards. At this point, the areas that were occupied by ISIS are some of the most heavily mined and explosive contaminated in the entire world. And the mine hazards come from three sources. So the first is that there's some legacy mining from previous wars. This has been fairly mapped out. There's some pretty good data on it, and its removal's ongoing. But the two main things are that ISIS used explosives in civilian locations as an intentional tactic to try to prevent civilians from returning home. So they mined pharmacies and schools and baby cribs and water plants. And talking to some of the United Nations mine action workers who were working on this last week, they said in Mosul that 90% of the buildings that they have assessed have some kind of explosive or booby trapping left by ISIS. So this is massive. And then the third type is unexploded coalition ordnance. So there are thousands of unexploded bombs in the cities, particularly in Mosul. And so addressing some of the demining and explosive hazard mitigation is really a key priority. A big challenge and gap in this is that right now there's funding and activity to address this at the public building level, so the public infrastructure and so forth, but there's nothing on housing. They're short of funding. They don't have, they need additional equipment, and they need additional legal permissions to be able to do this. So this is such a huge prerequisite for many of the other building to happen, and yet it's a bit, I think it's under the radar. The second security issue is of policing. So many of the security forces that fought ISIS or were hold forces are still in these areas. And in some cases they're very popular, and then in other cases the population is really coming to resent them as they don't have proper civilian police training. So Mosul needs an estimated 25,000 police. And these people have to be hired and trained. So the Italians and Canadians have been doing a lot to do some police training, but as of a couple of months ago, they had trained about 15,000, and a lot more are needed. And that's just Mosul. The U.S. is legally prohibited from investing in police training, but this is a big area that perhaps with some congressional activity could be a good investment for the United States in helping with training for community police. The third issue looked at was resuming city life. And I think this is the area that the Mosul conference seemed to focus most on with, people think of, oh, you have to rebuild the country. This is buildings and housing and water and power and so forth. And there was really tremendous damage. I mean, Mosul, all 5 bridges were damaged or destroyed. Roads, public utilities, heritage sites, 11 million tons of residential debris, 40,000 houses destroyed, 16 neighborhoods destroyed, water, sanitation, power, all largely destroyed or mined. I think the good news is that there are a lot of key infrastructure repairs underway. I think a misconception in the media was that the Kuwait conference was the start of the discussion of how do you rebuild or stabilize Mosul. And I think that misses the important activity that's been happening over the past year. So there are about 1,600 projects for stabilization that address some of these public infrastructure issues from UNDP. The World Bank in particular has been investing in power, electricity, water, et cetera. So those things are underway, but there's a lot more that needs to happen there. And so I think the Kuwait conference is really not the start of the conversation, but it's also not the end of the conversation as well. So 30 billion were committed, 88 billion was requested. But 30 billion is a lot, in particular when you think about absorptive capacity and what it takes to be able to spend that 30 billion. As Jeff and I and Alex and I were just talking before the panel started, a lot has to happen in order to make it possible to spend that. There needs to be some anti-corruption measures, processes and procedures put in place so that not every decision about every project has to get bumped up to the Prime Minister's office. So until some of these technical changes can happen, it's hard to absorb that 30 billion. Iraq also has resources from oil money, and the price of oil is going up. I think one risk there is that, as Bilal and I were just discussing before the panel, Iraq already has the second highest level of public sector employment in the world, right after Cuba. So 40% of employment is with the government. And so there's a risk that as oil prices go up and the Iraqi central government has a bigger budget, that there will be pressure to try to provide jobs and deal with some of the unemployment. So dealing with enabling the private sector, I think as Jeff will talk about, will be really key there as well. And then finally looking at governance and reconciliation issues. So our study looked at governance and reconciliation both at local and at national levels. At the local level, there are a lot of unresolved questions about what's going to happen in some of the provinces that had such disputes, for example, in Nineveh. Some of the minorities, for example, are calling to split up some of the provinces. So having a process in place to deal with some of these governance questions will be really key. Staffing will also be key. A lot of people kept their jobs under ISIS, but there's a difference between someone who continued cleaning the streets versus someone who engaged in criminal activity. And so it's important to come up with a set of standards and justice procedures that can help sort through that without repeating the mistakes of de-Baathification and just firing wholesale everyone who worked under ISIS, because there are big differences. And criminal activity should be defined and punished without collective punishment of everyone who continued living in these places. Reconciliation will also be a big issue. So neighboring communities just don't trust each other. They had a lot of trauma. And there were a handful of successful activities elsewhere of trying to do some community-level negotiation. So for example, at Camp Spiker in Tikrit, there was a local negotiation effort that brought parties together, resolution. So more efforts like these are really needed. We heard from the United Nations that Mosul could be done for, say, you could hire people to do community negotiation for about $2 million, and that would really enable some of the foundational work for keeping the peace. At the national level, a national reconciliation process still has never taken off, and I think this is one place where this is a role that is really key for the United States. This is something that only the U.S. has the convening power to be able to bring parties together and facilitate such a process. And I think this is one of the biggest places where the U.S. Could step forward, even if there's not much appetite for investing a lot of money, but by providing diplomatic facilitation over time to do that. On a more technical level, in 2013, Iraq passed a law to decentralize a lot of functions of the central government out to the provinces. And the purpose of this was to try to remove some of the tensions between provinces and Baghdad by giving provinces more control over their own public services like education, healthcare, youth management, sports, all these sorts of things for 8 ministries. And while there has been some progress on this, the U.S., World Bank, Canada have been providing support. Implementation has been very slow. And I personally think that for long-term stability in Iraq, the provinces will need to have, they'll need to be able to obtain a lot more local self-governance in these areas to be able to be satisfied. I think that's a fundamental set of activities for stability in the long term. So I think in sum, Iraq provided really a massive global public good in its part for defeating ISIS. And they took huge casualties, cities were destroyed, and our help as the international community is really needed. So there's a lot of attention on the monetary assistance, was it enough, was it not enough, et cetera. But I think the biggest area to enable this in the long term is technical assistance in helping Iraq deal with some of these foundational problems like demining, like their education system, like the centralization, improving the business climate so that investors can take these steps. So I think the biggest role at this point for the U.S. that's a gap is additional technical assistance and diplomatic support.
Thank you, Shelley. Jeff Batts, on to you, and saving the I guess the most difficult for last, because as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, this puts the burden on the private sector. This is a shift in how aid is delivered and how reconstruction is taking place. So you know the Iraqi market, you know the Iraqi private sector, you know the Western companies that want to invest in Iraq. How was the Kuwait conference received by the private sector, on whom this whole enterprise depends on, and generally how attractive is the Iraqi market for investors, and how about how deterrent are these challenges of corruption, red tape, chaos, both political, security, and legal chaos that exists in the country? How could companies adapt to this environment? And then the reverse of that as well. How can Iraq adapt to all of these demands, but also opportunities that is presented with? So
that's quite a complicated question.
That easy question.
First, thanks for having me. It's a great privilege to be here and to address everyone. I can't really speak for the private sector generally. I really don't know at this point what their reaction to the Kuwait conference is. But in my view, I look at the Kuwait conference, to the extent that I even understand what its purpose was, as misguided. Understandable, because the country faces extraordinary challenges that there probably isn't a complete solution to. But it's, to me, the latest in a long series of top-down, state-centered, mega project-driven investments that have largely failed. We've been at this for 15 years. Iraq is, before the price of oil collapsed, was bringing in over $100 billion a year in revenue, spending tens of billions of dollars on these massive projects, and they have very little to show for it. And I think we have to ask ourselves why that is. And again, from my point of view, it's largely because their political system is corrupt and sclerotic. That, as Shelley was saying, there's been $30 billion committed to rebuild the country, but it's not at all clear that they could even spend that money. And if they could spend it, would it even reach its intended targets? Would most of it not be siphoned off through various corruption schemes? And I think what we're looking at here is really sort of a failure at the Iraqi level and a failure at really every level, the international level, with the American government, with the coalition governments, and so on, to come up with creative and radical solutions to this really serious and acute crisis that they have. And to me, I I think we have to acknowledge that this top-down approach has failed, and that the best way that there's really an urgent need to stabilize the situation in post-ISIS occupied territories as quickly as possible. And the way to achieve that is to consider something radical like an oil dividend. Mm-hmm. I know it's been considered in the past and largely rejected, or very, very sort of summarily rejected. But we're dealing with people in Anbar and in Salah ad-Din and so on that are maybe living on $3,000 or $4,000 a year. Maybe they have 5 people in their family. If, you know, a $300 or $400 oil dividend distributed equally to each person wouldn't be that costly, and it would have an immediate impact on the standard of living for the people living in these areas. I also think it would do something that's been completely neglected since Saddam was overthrown 15 years ago. Namely, it would help develop their banking sector and their financial sector more broadly. That there's been little to no attention given to developing Iraq's capital markets, and there's been little to no attention given to developing their private banking space. And it's sort of remarkable if you think about it. You have this country that has a $200 billion GDP, and it has about 9% of that is private credit. It's very, 90% of the population doesn't use the banking system. So it's largely cash-based. And you know, these one-off projects, even if they were to work, and I don't mean to say that they're not essential. Based on what Shelley was describing up in Mosul, it seems like they are essential. But I question whether or not they can actually be effectively implemented. And if they can't be implemented, then it seems to me that what's needed is sort of a way to build Iraq up from the bottom up, and an oil dividend would be a way to do that. Another way to do it would be to consider privatizing non-resource-based assets like Trade Bank of Iraq, which could immediately raise between $1 and $2 billion for the Iraqi government. So that's sort of the way I'm looking at things.
Just a follow-up, and then I'll go back to more questions later on. But could you follow up on what you meant by a corrupt political system? How does that? I mean, we keep hearing that Iraq is corrupt, and we're hearing that it on the transparency index, it's one of the top worst 10. But for the private sector, what does corruption mean? How does it manifest itself? How do companies deal with it? How is Iraqi corruption distinct, I would say?
I think corruption takes place largely with the budget, when, from what I understand, when the money is allocated to the ministries and then they go ahead and allocate that money to their intended targets, that's where the corruption takes place. I mean, there have been various schemes over the past 15 years that involve the defense ministry, where they set up shell companies in Canada to overpay for military equipment and then pocket the excess. It takes place in the oil industry. It takes place with the state-owned banks. But I think that's the real issue, is that if you're going to disperse $10 billion to some mega project, how much of that money is actually going to make it there? There are going to be elites in the system that come up with schemes to siphon off much of that money. Not all of it, but enough of it where it really calls into question whether or not they can actually complete the project. And there's also these very long lead times between the signing of a contract and its actual implementation. And that too sort of gives people a lot of opportunity for corruption. So, but I mean, there's literally an infinite number of schemes involved in siphoning off state revenues from the state or money from the state. And the larger the project, the more likely it is that corruption is going to be involved.
I see. Well, thank you all very much. I am not going to abuse my moderator's prerogative and ask the first questions. I'd like to actually go to the audience right away. I have my own questions. I'll probably sandwich them in between yours. But as you can, as we hear from the panel, we heard three different views of the challenges of Iraq, the opportunities that Iraq has, and they kind of help qualitatively and quantitatively that the country is receiving to move forward. So with that, let me open it up to you. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Wait for the mic. Introduce yourself, and then please ask a question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Dilman Abdul Qadir. I run the Kurdish project at the Endowment for Middle East Truth. It was mentioned that there was $30 billion promised or guaranteed. I'm not sure if it was guaranteed to Iraq. But what does this mean for the Kurdistan regional government? Is that seen as a separate issue? Especially, I know they're having budget disputes right now. And also, a follow-up question is, how much did Iran invest in Iraq? Because they're so heavily invested in the political stage and also their military as well. Thank you.
Two very important questions. Who would like to chime in? Alex?
So I'll answer your first question first, because I was at the Reconstruction Conference and there was Iranian intervention. So in terms of an official response, they didn't contribute anything monetarily to the reconstruction. On the budget disputes and the Kurdish issue, there were several Kurdish projects included in the 200 projects presented during the conference, and there were Kurdish officials present at the Reconstruction Conference. I think it will be up to the government of Iraq to sit down and prioritize the projects and figure out where the greatest needs are and how to address them. Thank you.
Shelley?
I wasn't at the conference, and so I don't know specifically. I do know the KRG went in with a list of projects that it was requesting. I would mention the need on the KRG side. So the study that I just did and talked about was about Mosul, but. As part of that study, we looked at, in particular, how this was affecting various provinces. And the Kurdistan region took an enormous number of the IDPs, bumping up its own population, something like 25%. This was a strain on education, healthcare, electricity and water, et cetera. So there was enormous strain placed on some of the cities regionally, and so I think that there is a pretty big need, in particular, to help with cities adapt to the additional presence of IDPs. So a lot of my work from 2010 to 2014 was working with the KRG on its education system. And we had a series of contracts to do that, and it was interesting because as an example, the Kurdistan region was trying to get all students in school up through grade 9. And so to implement that, what that meant was that suddenly almost 100% of the schools in the Kurdistan region now had 2 shifts of kids. So instead of kids having 6 hours a day, they would have 4 and 4 hours. And some were triple shifts. And I think because of the addition of the internally displaced people, with this additional bump, now there's a lot more situations where many schools are triple shifting. So what does this mean to schooling? And that's one example of how the impact of displaced people is affecting different kinds of provinces. But I think this is something that needs to be thought about in the long term, that if people don't go home and they do stay in their new locations, how do you help the cities that are now hosting the IDPs to adapt with their public services?
Jeffy might pick up on Dilman's question. Is there an opportunity, particularly to reconstruction, for the KRG and the Iraqi government to cooperate? I mean, particularly in Mosul, you see most of the cement factories are closer to Mosul, actually, in Iraqi Kurdistan. Is this an opportunity for a win-win situation that technically and economically that might push the political envelope a little bit forward?
I really don't know how to answer that question. I'm not sure anybody does, but it's not clear to me who is effectively in control of the Kurdish government at this point in time. That might just be my own ignorance, but given the crisis that they had after the referendum fell apart, Masoud Barzani supposedly steps down, but you hear that he's still involved in in the situation behind the scenes. So it's not clear to me how Baghdad, I mean, I know Baghdad is publicly negotiating with the Prime Minister, Nasrallah Barzani, but I think they have a long way to go before ironing out very basic problems before they could even get to something that complicated.
That level of cooperation.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Edward Marks from Simon Center. Could someone give us a brief overview of what the Iraqi government's own revenue stream is? I presume largely from oil and taxes, and the categories into which it is largely dispersed.
Alex?
Yes, so as you already identified, majority of government's revenues comes from its sale of oil. There's to some extent tax collection and customs, and a lot of the revenue has been spent on the fight against ISIS and providing support to those displaced. 80%, I've seen statistics stating that 80% of the support to IDPs has been provided by the government of Iraq, and obviously salaries to the state employees, etc. I don't have the numbers.
I think they bring in they're on an annual run rate right now of about $72 billion a year in oil revenue. I think taxes maybe make up another 2 or 3% of that. It's quite low. It's almost entirely coming from oil. So when oil was over $100 a barrel, they weren't exporting as much as they are now, but they were bringing in well over 100. I think the most they ever brought in was maybe 110 or 120 billion in public revenue, and most of that is given. When they're not in a sort of a war posture, then it goes to the Interior Ministry, which is going to cover domestic security, and it goes to oil, it goes to education, it goes to health. It's pretty broadly distributed, actually.
I would add that the challenge with Iraq's revenue is not that there isn't enough of it. Iraq is a rich country, and even as at $50 per barrel, Iraq was making record revenue. The challenge is how does the Iraqi government spend that money? There is no break between the amount of money that Iraq makes by selling oil and how much it spends. It's basically a one-way street. There's no stop in the budgeting process. So they basically look at how much money they're going to be able to make over this year, and then they budget their spending accordingly, rather than the other way around. Another way of saying this is that Iraq's oil revenues are seen as revenues and not as capital, and therefore oil money prices could go up, government budget could go up, but then the percentage of spending will stay constant. So maybe there will be more money flowing into the country, but that positive ripple effect that you would want to have it in the economy, that is missing. And that's because basically what earlier Jeff mentioned, it's a state-centric economy. The ability for money to be saved into a banking system and therefore creating a line of credit for small businesses and entrepreneurs, that positive virtuous cycle is missing in the Iraqi system. And one of the hopes of this Kuwait conference, by focusing on the private sector and investment, is to create the kind of strong incentives for the Iraqi government to actually use one of the benefits of being state-centric to reform the economy. The World Bank and the IMF are providing incentives, but also technical advice for Iraq to finally do this. And then, at least it's my hope that the outcome of the Kuwait conference would spotlight that this is not just a election campaign that Iraqi officials would pledge, but without these kind of tough reforms, the Iraqi government won't be able to cash in on all of those pledges, because at the end of the day, they will be going through the private sector. So, to me, that was one of the main outcomes of this conference, to prove it to the Iraqi decision maker and the policymakers that these reforms are not luxuries. It's not an ideological issue. They're necessary for the country to be rebuilt.
I'd also add that they typically don't spend what is allocated. So the budget might allocate, say, $60 or $70 billion to various sectors of the economy, or of the country, rather. But they often come well short of that. So on paper, they might show that they're running a deficit, a fiscal deficit, when in fact they end up having a surplus. And that, again, is an illustration of the ineffectiveness that we're dealing with at the government level. They can't spend the money. The mechanisms just simply aren't in place. And to me, this is the problem that needs to be resolved first.
If I can just
Dave, and then Patrick. Oh,
I was
Kelly.
just going to respond that I think that discussion really speaks again to the need of, if we want to help Iraq succeed in the longer term, what does it need? And creating some of these changes that improve the business environment and reduce corruption, enable fast decisions on investment, reduce the inclination to try to provide employment for most of the population through the government. That sort of technical assistance and even conditionality is such an important role that the U.S. could be playing right now.
Dave.
The Washington Institute. First, for Jeffrey, what kind of dividend were you thinking of with the neighborhood, sort of like Alaska or something like that?
Alaska would be hard because it requires a fund, which would mean that you actually have to build up capital over a period of time, invest it, and then distribute it. I think they need immediate help, and that would come from just taking, saving a percentage of the oil revenues maybe for 6 months to a year, and then making a distribution from that. And you could start off very modestly, maybe $200, $300, $400 a person. I mean, the details would have to be worked out to make sure it was compatible with other pressing needs, but it would have to start off very small, I think.
Thanks. And for Alex and Shelley, is there any view that our bullishness or enthusiasm for the Reconstruction might change depending on the outcome of the elections?
So obviously, elections will play a big role in shaping the government post, in May, and will impact some of it. That said, I think that the Iraqi government understands that the reforms that are putting in place, and again, they've been working very closely with the World Bank and the IFC, and separately with the IMF as part of their standby arrangement on the reform package. They understand that they need to do it in order to rebuild. That there won't be, buckets of money coming from countries to help them with that. So this is on them to reform their system. And I think that you see already some of the positive movement in that area. During the conference, a couple of items that they addressed as part of their reform package was, their steps taken and underway to accede to the New York Arbitration Convention, the steps that they're taking to have one-stop shop for investors as part of the NIC under the National Investment Committee. And also separately, Prime Minister Abadi created this committee under Prime Minister's office for investment and reconstruction projects, kind of to address the issues that Jeff mentioned, to streamline the process of approvals of those projects that are strategically important for the government of Iraq. So I suspect that regardless of the outcome of the elections, those will continue because otherwise, Iraq won't be able to address some of those pressing needs. So I think that will continue.
In Baghdad and elsewhere a couple weeks ago, as well as recent meetings, in trying to do an update about what are the pressing needs on stabilization, we've asked that question up and down. How will the elections, various permutations of who wins, affect U.S. support? And what I think what was really interesting was that when people just sat down and laid out what the election coalitions are, I mean, that there's pretty much no viable coalition that all the viable coalitions will probably need to involve multiple different types of people. That a Shiite majority coalition getting a landslide without having to collaborate with other parts of Iraq may just not be feasible in this election. And that will have a tremendous pressure on, I think, moderating any sort of outcome from candidates. So I think that you can't predict the future, but I think that is a positive. It's positively looking at the crystal ball.
I'll just add to this that it's probably a boost to frame this in how this conference might impact countering Iranian influence, which was also brought up earlier. The Iranian model of creating leverage in Iraq is through networks, individuals, parties, militias. The Iranian government rarely engages state institutions, and when it does, it's not with the goal of empowering state institutions, because a strong state is seen to Iran as a threat. Because if the state's strong and the wrong actors are elected into the government, that may pose a danger to Iran's stability. What this conference does is the exact reverse of this. They're saying that this is a commitment to Iraq and to the Iraqi government. They're working with the Iraqi government and supporting the kind of reforms that will, we hope, spur the Iraqi private sector to emerge. Now, of course, having said this, this doesn't mean that Iran won't benefit from the money that's going to flow into Iraq, because they do have their networks, especially in the real estate and the reconstruction sectors or the construction sectors. So Iran's going to benefit, but at the end of the day, one of the political hopes of this conference was to support and bolster official state institutions and empower them to be the vehicle for reconstruction, moving, therefore, the political process forward and give them more legitimacy, some of which they lost, obviously, after ISIS incursion into Iraq. Dr. Clausen.
Could you tell, Jeff, Patrick Clausen, the Director of Research here. Jeff, could you tell us a little bit about what the Baghdad private sector feels like these days? And in particular, what it feels like for a international private investor?
Well, their stock market is up almost 25% this year. It's actually quite strong. Business, they essentially went through something that was similar to the Great Depression in the United States, say in the early part of the 1930s. GDP contracted for 2 consecutive years. Hopefully it will expand again this year. But what we're seeing is that things kind of bottomed out in early 2016 and sort of skipped along the bottom for a year, started to recover in 2017, and then in late 2017, following through into the beginning of 2018, there's been a real liftoff with the companies that we're involved in and the sectors that we focus on. And you can see this at hotels. The Babylon Hotel is one of the main places to stay in Baghdad, outside of the international zone, and their sales were up almost 150% in 2017 compared to 2016, and that's largely driven by increased occupancy. Anecdotally, the flights into Baghdad are completely full, and there's a lot of foreigners. It's not just Iraqis on these flights. It's not just people from the Middle East. You see a lot of people from Asia, from Europe. There's a real sense that there's opportunity, and people are in Baghdad sniffing out that opportunity right now. So it's actually, from where I sit and the sort of investments that I make, I haven't been this optimistic for the companies that we own since 2010, 2011. Things look really good. It's just a question of whether or not they look really good relative to where they were. The question is how, is it sustainable, and will there be another, shock of some kind that knocks them off course?
And if I can add to what Jeff said, I think that was evident during the private sector event on the 13th. I think that the companies that have been in Iraq for a long time, I think that there is a sense of cautious optimism that things are improving. Obviously, the interest from the private sector was very, very large. And, talking to some people, like in an energy sector, for instance, who have been in Iraq for many, many years, they said, first time in 12 years, we're actually, optimistic and see kind of enthusiasm coming from the company. So, again, it will depend on how Iraq and the government the government of Iraq follows through on some of those reforms that they're putting in place. But I think that the attitude and the feeling at the conference was of optimism that things are on the up.
And I'll say this, just based on the dealings I have with people in Iraq, particularly in the business class, we seem to be more worried about the elections than they are. They really don't care. From their point of view, it doesn't matter who's prime minister, it doesn't matter who's president, it doesn't matter who's speaker of parliament. They get up every day and they're trying to make money. And the conditions are pretty good right now for them to do that. So from their point of view, it just doesn't matter. Now, that may not be the right way to look at it, but that's definitely their attitude. They're more, as Alex said, they're more optimistic than they've been in a very long time.
That's actually quite interesting. Yes, sir. Would you wait for the mic, please?
Ray Tanter, American Committee on Human Rights and the Iran Policy Committee, former fellow, adjunct fellow here. My question is whether or not the popular mobilization forces are a hindrance or a facilitator of Iraq reconstruction, and in particular, the Iranian ambassador to Iraq has often been a member of the Pastaran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Is he or she a facilitator or hindrance of Iraq reconstruction?
It's a fun question. Who would like to take a stab at it?
I mean, these are people who are employed. They're getting paid to fight a war. They have weapons. What happens if they come back and they don't have jobs and they still have weapons? I would imagine that's a recipe for disaster. So yeah, it could be a hindrance. And I think that's, again, speaks to the urgency of stabilizing things, not just in the Sunni and Kurdish areas of Iraq, but also, I mean, Basra is where most of the oil is, or in the southern provinces where you find most of the oil, and it's where most of it is exported from. But you don't have potable water in Basra. The situation in Basra is economically not nearly as good as it should be. There hasn't been much. There's been some new construction there over the last few years, but not nearly enough. And that's where the PMUs are coming back to, or these places. So I think there's a very strong urgency to stabilize the situation, not just for Sunnis in the west and north and Kurds in the north, but for the whole country. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem.
Shelley?
Yeah, I'd add that the PMF were important for a while in serving as hold forces so that ISIS didn't move right back in. But at this point, they're becoming they're a cause of frustration to local populations, in particular when they're perceived as from a different ethnicity and so forth. And so at some point, there needs to be a managed process of switching that out for trained police. This goes back to the comments about, well, if you're going to do that, something has to replace the PMF. That locally trained police forces with training in community policing, which is very different than being a soldier, so that local forces can take over. And this requires training. It requires hiring them. And then also, as Jeff was just mentioning, the employment issue of what happens to these young men if they go home. And we heard a lot about this from the Iraqi government in Baghdad last time, because these are people who have fought, they have weapons, they may not have job skills. What do they do if they go home and don't have a job. That's a recipe for problems. So any kind of demobilization needs to really take into account, well, how do they integrate into the economy? You know, can they be hired and retrained as police? Can they get job skills or job training so that they can integrate into other parts of the economy? So that would need to be a very managed process, or it could be a problem.
Alex?
So I just want to highlight one point, because when we when people speak of popular mobilization forces, you know, the tendency is to think that these are all Iranian-backed militia, but that's not really the case. You know, there are some groups that maybe answer or have been answering to other powers, but majority of the people who are part of the popular mobilization forces are the ones who answered to Sistani's fatwa when he called for support and to fight ISIS when they invaded Iraq in 2014. And I think, to echo what Jeff and Shelley already said, I think the job opportunity and creation will be crucial. And I think that in some aspect, you know, the reconstruction offers that opportunity, because a lot of it will be construction and heavy labor project. So hopefully there will be a way to when they come back home and, you know, have no jobs in the South, you know, that there will be projects ongoing that can employ them. So I think that that might be one way of addressing that.
I would just add one point, Rick, that one of the problems why Iraq has had consistent violence is that war pays, fighting pays. You know, the governments are willing to cut the civil servants' salaries in order to pay the war effort. You know, in the Iraqi government, everyone every civil servant had to take a 5% salary cut in order for the popular mobilization units to be paid. In the KRG, for example, all of the civil servants took a pay cut except for the Peshmerga because they were fighting. Of course, you're not gonna. So regardless of right or wrong, when you look at the economy, to be a fighter, regardless of for who, it's a secure job. And so part of the importance of having a vibrant private sector, when I mentioned earlier that 60% of the population is below the age of 25, that's not the kind of labor force that the government and the state-centric economy that Jeff mentioned can absorb. It's only through the private sector. And yes, we're not talking about, you know, tech that needs a lot of training. It's reconstruction, and it's all of the ripple effects that reconstruction projects bring with them. So maybe these reforms are the kind of opportunities that the youth will see as an alternative to joining any of these fighting groups. Inshallah, as you said.
There's actually a burgeoning tech sector in Baghdad right now. It's actually pretty fascinating. But again, the problem is, I mean, they have incubators. You have these really smart, young, entrepreneurial Iraqis in Baghdad and other parts of the country setting up companies that are similar to Uber, similar to Grubhub, which was like an online food delivery service, or Zillow, and for real estate. And it's very sophisticated stuff that they're working on. But they can't form a company. It takes too long. The LLC, forming the equivalent of an LLC in Iraq is extraordinarily Byzantine, and so they just don't do it. So they don't have bank accounts, and again, everything is cash-based as a result of that. So there's something non-oil-based that gives you reason for optimism that it's being stunted because there isn't really a private financial system.
Let me actually broaden this issue. We talked about Iran, we talked about diversification, but the goal of diversification is not just an Iraqi goal, it's also a Gulf country's goal. The Saudi government, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, they've all pledged to diversify their economies away from oil. What are the prospects of integrating the Iraqi market to the greater regional Arab market? And then the flip side of this question is, how much of the Arab countries' help to Iraq is self-driven, interest-driven, genuinely for domestic national interest vis-a-vis, saying yes to Washington's request for the neighbors to be responsible and be accountable? Alex, maybe. take a stab at that.
So I will start with the integration of Iraq into regional markets. I think that, you know, prior to ISIS, for instance, the road between Jordan and Iraq was open and fully operational, and there was a lot of goods coming through it. You know, now we are working very closely to have that trade reestablished. So the border crossing was reopened recently. The reapproachment with the Gulf states, you know, after 25 years, Saudi Arabia opened the embassy, what follow is, you know, a stream of high-level visits between the two countries that culminated in their bilateral strategic meetings in Riyadh in the fall. I think that some of it, you know, I think that obviously we encourage reapproachment. I think that everybody sees that getting Iraqi back into the regional market would benefit Iraq, will provide alternatives for its trade, you know, and will open it to additional markets. I think some of it is, you know, driven by the market economy. I mean, for instance, you know, Kuwait and Iraq are talking about gas exports from Iraq to Kuwait. There is a discussion about the pipeline project through Jordan. So I think that some of it's in the interest of the regional players. Some of it is, you know, after ISIS and having the more moderate government in Iraq with Prime Minister Abadi kind of open to re-engagement with the Gulf states, I think that they seize that opportunity and so an opening. And I think that what we see from Washington is that the relationship with regional countries is definitely progressing. And I would just mention that with Kuwait in particular, I mean, I think it remained to be very good throughout. Kuwait has been very good neighbor to Iraq. The hosting of the conference was just another example of, you know, what they've been doing to help Iraq through this crisis. So,
great, thank you. Bayan Khan.
Thank you. I'm Bayan Sami Abdurrahman, the Kurdistan Regional Government representative. I just wanted to comment on something that Mr. Butt said, which was about President Barzani's role and who is really running the KRG. President Barzani did step down in November, and the people running the KRG are the cabinet, led by the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. President Barzani remains president of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is one of the leading parties in Kurdistan and Iraq, and he will continue to have a role, and I think that's beneficial to all of Iraq, not just Kurdistan. But I think we all need to be clear that it is the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister who are making the decisions on the day-to-day running of the government. My question really is about reconciliation. I think there is a danger, and certainly you hear this from the minorities other than the KRG. Even if you put the KRG aside, you certainly hear this from the Christian and Yazidi community, that all this money and effort to support Iraq financially and economically is going to bypass them, and that they won't have a say in what happens to the funding, to the rebuilding of their areas, and to their role in the economy. How does the panel see a way around that so that the minorities and all of the communities feel involved in this project to rebuild Iraq, not just economically, but hopefully socially as well? Thank you.
Shelley?
Sure. That's a key question, because so while most of the displaced currently are Sunnis, the biggest percentages of communities that are displaced are among minorities, the Christians, Yazidis, Shabaks, et cetera. And I think what you see in the data is that the Christians and Yazidis in particular are picking up and leaving Iraq, which is really sad. Iraq has been a very heterogeneous country for centuries or millennia, and it's losing a lot of its minorities. That said, some things that would improve their circumstances and that are really needed. I think, so first of all, the U.S. through USAID has, and maybe Alex can speak to this a little bit more, has been investing in particularly into some of the minority regions. This is a bit controversial in the aid community. Should you be focusing on minorities or should you be focusing on everybody, et cetera? But that is one thing that's being done. But I think that important steps that remain to be done are some of the local reconciliation efforts that I mentioned. There need to be significant efforts put at negotiating dispute resolutions at the very local level, and then also going back again to the policing issue, helping local regions with their own police forces so that they do feel protected. So they need to feel protected. They need to feel like they've got a future in Iraq, or Iraq will be bleeding out its minorities for a long time. I think some of the Christians are starting to go back. I talked to some a couple of weeks ago. They're moving back in. They're feeling a bit hopeless. Most of the Yazidis, though, are still living in really squalid camps, and I think something like several 100,000 are in really bad camps, and there's no home to go back to because a lot of their villages and towns are just so heavily mined that some of the stabilization reconstruction can't even start. So these are huge issues that need to be addressed through those ways of reconciliation, some of the demining, policing, and so forth.
If I may add, one of the principal sources of instability since Saddam fell was the shock of Saddam falling itself and what it did to a society that was used to this Ba'athist political and economic system for decades. It's interesting that two of the main Sunni provinces did not vote in favor of the Constitution. So Iraq just barely had the percentages needed for the Constitution to become law. And this speaks to a very big problem that's plagued the country since 2003, which is most people there feel like they don't have a stake in the system. And again, this, in my view, transcends sect and ethnicity. This is not something that's a Kurdish issue or a Sunni issue or a Yazidi issue. It applies to Shia just as well, or just as much. And again, I think an oil dividend is a way to bypass that problem. I think that one of the virtues of it, apart from what it could do to the financial sector, is that it gives people direct stake in the system, something they have not had really since 2003.
And I just want to add that, U.S. government has provided over $265 million in stabilization assistance that help bring back home, over 3 million displaced Iraqis, and aside from providing the immediate or restoring the immediate needs, we've a lot of that programming has gone to the mining efforts to help clear, areas from mines so that some of that stabilization work can start. Because as Shelley said, the need for the mining is enormous in Iraq. So we focus on that and bringing the basic services to communities and bringing people that would allow to bring people home. So again, through USAID and through our stabilization funding for stabilization, we have been able to make a difference there.
Thank you, Paul.
Retired State Department. Quick question. I'm on the board of a U.S. and UK foundation that works with Christians. And for Mr. Batt and others, might there be an appetite for an investment or other fund focused on the Yazidi and Christian areas? Another question of if this dividend is paid, would it be paid to Iraqis outside Iraq, particularly the refugees in Jordan?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. That's above my pay grade. I don't know how you figure that one out. I'm just thinking conceptually. But I doubt very I have very serious doubts that anyone would be interested in allocating money for, if it's for profit, to these minority communities. I just don't think, I mean, there has to be something to invest in, and I'm not sure what, there have to be businesses, companies, real estate of some kind that you look at and see a profit opportunity, and I just don't see what that would be at this point. So unfortunately, I don't think people would be interested.
I would add just two quick comments. The idea of establishing funds is something that Iraq hasn't really looked into seriously. It goes back to my earlier comment about how there is no break between revenue streams and spending streams. So having a fund, either Iraq probably is far away from having a sovereign wealth fund, but establishing it and then waiting for the opportunity to actually put some money into a sovereign wealth fund or into let's say a development fund or a reconstruction fund, a break on that automatic flow from revenue into spending into budget is necessary. So maybe what you're proposing is one, but on the question of dividends, in fact, our friends at the Center for Global Development, they have published a book, a research on the viability of the dividend project, the dividend program for Iraq. They get lessons from the Norwegian model, the Alaska model, and others, and they look into the pros and cons of that. But they do also agree with Jeff that it is one of those ideas, despite its shortcomings, that's going to have some benefits of reducing the state centrality in the economy, which is a leftover of the Ba'athist socialist regime on one hand, and second, it empowers the citizenry. There is some sort of a social security system in Iraq anyways, in the form of the food rations and the fuel rations. So this would be monetizing that. Instead of the government buying the food, it would be basically more empowering and therefore more conducive to the rise of private sector, small business entrepreneurship, but obviously in the absence of a banking sector and the opportunity for people to save, that money will basically encourage more consumerism, which is one of the reasons why there is little that Iraq can show for when oil prices were $130, $140 per barrel. The other point that I wanted to add is about economic reforms, and for these changes to take place, for it not just to be a top-down request and a top-down demand, there's also education needed for the Iraqi public. Case in point is cutting subsidies for electricity, for power generation and power distribution. It really works. The Iraqi government has been really wasting record amounts of money. There are research and numbers that I won't go into the details. When the Iraqi government piloted the project of actually charging citizens of 2 neighborhoods in Iraq for electricity, the government made more money, and those neighborhoods ended up having 24/7 electricity. Having these kind of models on one hand, but also education. So cutting subsidies is one of the IMF and the World Bank demands. But for people to understand how that works and what does it mean for the government to make gasoline more expensive or to make electricity more expensive requires some bottom-up level of understanding and education. One thing about subsidies is, I've tried this with my students when I was teaching in Iraq. Maybe the economics is not so difficult to explain, but just in terms of values, that subsidies are not fair. It's more beneficial to the rich and the wealthy and those who have 2 8-cylinder cars versus the guy with a scooter. But that kind of education is not really taking place that much. So some of these sound economic policies that the Iraqi government and the Kurdish government have adopted sometimes make it politically tough to sell. We have a few more minutes for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Did I see a hand there? Yes, Eric? Maybe our last question for the day.
Yeah, thanks, Bilal. Thanks so much, panelists. This was tremendous. I think one of the things that I'm just imagining is, with this conference in Kuwait, generating assistance and loans, investments, that helps. But there's also the humanitarian side, which you guys started to talk a little bit about, and even as Bond was talking about, looking at the local level, making sure the local community needs are being met. And with some of these big projects, that might not happen. So My first question is the role of civil society. I know there was one day devoted to civil society, but it ended up being 2 conferences at 2 different locations. I'm just curious, any view on that? And I will just give this quick example. The city of Kuwait, or the city of Mosul, after it was liberated, the private healthcare centers were reopened, restored, and it was civil society organizations that did that. It was civil society organizations that were paying the salaries of the health workers. And even to this day, the government of Iraq is providing some assistance for those salaries, but civil society is addressing the gap. So the fact that, as I understand the process going into the Kuwait conference, it seemed like there was a bit of a missed opportunity to really consult and involve civil society across Iraq. Some groups were involved, but not necessarily inclusively. And then secondly, on the humanitarian response plan from the UN, I believe that the announcement was expected any day now. What is going to be that amount, and what pledges or pledging conference might happen? Because that's a case where you actually do need donors and funds to support those needs. Thanks.
Alex?
So as you mentioned, there was the first of the day of the conference was devoted to civil society and NGOs, and there were 2 different parallel events. One that was hosted by the International Islamic Council, and then the other one that was part of the Reconstruction Conference. And from the very beginning, and I think that this was very evident in the planning for the event, there was this understanding that the civil society and NGOs would play an important role in reconstruction. The idea of hearing from local communities, from people on the ground in those small towns and communities, what's important to them and how they envision, reconstruction taking place in their communities, identifying the projects and identifying obstacles to reconstruction, and kind of identifying the best practices of what, on the implementation side. So unfortunately, I wasn't part of the conference that took place that was hosted by ILC. I was at the expert meetings that they had as part of the Reconstruction Conference. There were several NGOs, both local and international, that were present. And I think that will continue to play a role in the government planning. And the fact that, in leading up to the Reconstruction Conference and working with the World Bank and the IFC and the UN playing a part as a co-sponsor to the event, I think you will continue to see civil society and NGOs being part of that conversation.
Yeah, to add to that, I think the humanitarian issues really, it's 2 challenges. It's first the IDPs, and then second, once people return to their cities, how do they adapt, and what do they find there for them? And since I already discussed a little bit the IDPs, I'd like to focus a little bit on the cities. So when people move back to their cities, they have to find instantly basic services, and a lot of those are being rebuilt again. Power, water, electricity. But just to give you an overview of what's happening with education and health, which are 2 really key things. Families won't move back if their kids can't get education and they can't live there if there's not health. So in terms of healthcare, let's say in Mosul, the healthcare capacity was really damaged. About only a quarter of the hospital beds were remaining at the end of the battle. 5,000 healthcare workers had fled, mainly living in Erbil. So that just the capacity to deliver basic healthcare, emergency healthcare, was pretty much stripped. So getting all that back up and running is a huge priority, and that starts with you have to demine the hospital first, and then there are these various layers that's required for that. I think there is planning and there is work through the UN managed stabilization program. I think a really long-term challenge that starts at a humanitarian level but then really is generational is education, because so when ISIS took over cities, it shut all the schools and then reopened them with an ISIS curriculum, and it was indoctrinating. They taught 1 + 1 = 2 with pictures of bullets, and they did math problems with, how do you calculate explosives, or how do you calculate how many people you can kill with suicide bombs. It was really, their curriculum was really disturbing. And so because of that, a lot of parents also just took their kids out of school. So all told, in these ISIS-occupied areas, there are 1 million kids who studied the ISIS curriculum, and then large numbers of kids who just did not attend school for periods of time. So how do you get them back into school, and how do you undo this, both the trauma and the indoctrination? And that's a humanitarian issue, but it's also going to take long-term strategizing and investment, and I think is really key to the future of Iraq, because if that's not addressed, what do those people do when they grow up? And you can hear examples of that. Like, so, for example, visiting some of the Nineveh camps and then talking to the Iraqi aid workers, they said that the kids would come in and would rebuke other Iraqis for not dressing conservatively enough, or they'd sing ISIS songs because that's what they knew. So all this has to be undone, but in a way that takes into account these various aspects, the humanitarian needs, these economic needs, the long-term security needs. I think that's going to be a really big challenge for Iraq to address in the future.
With those policy recommendations, I think we covered quite some territory, from politics, economics, markets, civil society, geopolitics, local and regional dynamics here. So thank you so much to the panel. Please join me in thanking the panel, and thank you so much for joining us as well. Have a good afternoon, and have a nice weekend.
I look forward to reading the book.
Yeah.